All right, eighth grade. How you guys doing? Today we're going to talk about World War II, Axis versus Allies. Anybody ever play that game? It's a fun game. But the game is fun. War is definitely not. You'll see World War II is pretty horrendous on that scale of what happened. Um, World War II, it takes place in a lot of different theaters. Um, by theater, I mean like where they fought. It spans anywhere from 6 to 8 years, depending on who you talk to and what date you use. There's no way I'm going to give you the history of World War II in the next, 10 to 15 minutes. So I'm hitting highlights, and you can always ask me questions. If you got any questions, feel free to ask me, for more detail. Happy to provide it. All right, so I'd shown this slide before, just a reminder, German aggression, taking these different portions of land, annexing Austria, taking the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, swallowing up the rest of Czechoslovakia, and then taking land from Lithuania. So Hitler miscalculates. He figures he's gotten away with all this other stuff, and England and France are clearly very interested in peace. And he decides to invade Poland. He makes up this pretext, like pretends that some Polish soldiers had captured a radio station on German soil and started transmitting, some kind of broadcast. Obviously, totally made up. They were actually German soldiers dressed in Polish uniforms. Although I think they did have one Polish soldier that they produced, a dead body. But anyway, invades Poland. And like I just said, in this bullet here, Germany didn't expect England and France to declare war this time. And it was common knowledge, not necessarily that Poland was going to be split, but that Russia and Germany had signed this non-aggression pact. They'd agreed not to go to war with one another. And then it became apparent on September 17th when Russia invaded eastern Poland and finished off Poland. So now France and England find themselves kind of alone against Germany. And they have what they call the phony war. So basically, France really didn't do anything. They declared war, England and France both flew some sorties, with aircraft over Germany, did some bombing, but nothing much, right? And it's known as the phony war. This will change when the Germans eventually invade and conquer France. So you've probably heard of the German Blitzkrieg before. It means lightning war. There's a lot of different ideas involved, but probably most importantly is always constantly driving forward, right? Never necessarily stopping to consolidate, which works better in shorter, non-protracted wars. It worked initially for the Germans quite a bit. It became less difficult to enact as the war went on. But, that said, they conquered Poland, Denmark. Well, you can see the list here, and you can see the map. Conquered a lot of places in the span of 2 years, a little less than 2 years. So, clearly what they were doing initially in the war worked very well for them. So flipping over to the Pacific Theater, Japan attacks the U.S. July 25th, 1941. Japan invades Indochina. So that would be modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. At the time, it was owned by the French. And they invade because the French had been, at this point, conquered by the Germans. And the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands all cease oil exports to Japan. So all three have a lot of oil that they have access to, either through colonies or in the case of the U.S., in the continental U.S. And they cease these oil exports to Japan. Well, Japan now doesn't have a source of oil. So, and they'd already been making plans, but by September 41, their forces are trained. They're ready for this, for the attack on Pearl Harbor. They try diplomacy. They try to get oil from other places. They can't. So in their minds, they see the only real avenue is for them to take the British and Dutch colonies, get the oil there. And in the process, they don't think the U.S. is going to stand by. So they also attack the Philippines and Pearl Harbor. You can see what happens from Admiral Yamamoto's plan. And I put here, this marks the sixth surprise attack against another country by Japan without a declaration of war since 1884. So my question to you today down in the comments section is the Japanese attack of Pearl Harbor truly unexpected in light of their history of the surprise attack? And was the surprise attack unethical? In other words, was it wrong? I have actually, honestly, no opinion one way or the other. I'm not a particular fan of war in general, but I think it's an interesting question based on culturally what the Japanese expect and what they have done historically. So you answer that how you will down in the comments. Was it really unexpected? And was that attack, was that surprise attack wrong? Was it unethical? All right, so here's the Japanese Pacific Theater 36 to 45. That red line kind of shows, the maximum extent that the Japanese expanded before they started to contract and be pushed back to the home islands. Battle of Midway is really the turning point in the Pacific Theater. Up until then, the U.S. hadn't won a battle. They've been defeated everywhere. In some of the Solomon Islands, in the Philippines, at Hawaii. So in Midway, the Navy led by Yamamoto is certain that the United States in a longer war will win because they just have the industrial production, which is what essentially happened. So they wanted to wipe out the rest of the carrier fleet of the United States Navy and hopefully get them to sue for peace, or at least have an advantage for a lot longer. And the Imperial Japanese Navy, that's the IJN, the code had been cracked by the U.S. Navy. So it helps them know that the attack's coming. But even so, it was a very close thing. A lot of mistakes were made by both sides. And eventually it ends up with the loss of 4 aircraft carriers and 300 pilots to the Imperial Japanese Navy. It doesn't seem like a lot, but in this new era of naval warfare, carriers are not easy to make. They're not easy to replace. Trained pilots are not easy to replace. Japanese pilots are the best pilots in the world at this point. They've been flying combat missions since the 30s. And just this fact here shows you U.S. built 53 carriers to 25 Japanese carriers throughout the war. And these U.S. carriers are all purpose built. Some of these Japanese carriers are converted from cruisers or whatnot. And so, they cannot match the industrial output of the United States. And so not only was it the first defeat of the Japanese, but it was a lot of equipment and trained manpower that they weren't able to replace. And again, marks kind of the turning point. The U.S. starts to push the Japanese back in the Pacific Theater. The turning point in Europe was Stalingrad. Hitler tries to take the city because it's called Stalingrad, and the leader of Soviet Union at this time is Stalin. So it's this, propaganda like, hey, look, we took Stalingrad. He can't even defend his own city. It really was not a place that should have been attacked in the first place. And the German Sixth Army becomes bogged down in this city warfare. The Germans have not been stopping in cities. They've been going around them and letting them starve. And in this case, they try and take the city. And Field Marshal Zhukov springs his trap, captures and destroys basically the entire German Sixth Army, 300,000 soldiers, 2,000 artillery pieces, over 10,000 vehicles. Again, the first major defeat for the Germans, which is important psychologically, but then also a lot of manpower materials that they cannot replace. Again, kind of like in the case of Japan and the United States, a smaller country with fewer people and not as large of an industrial output, losing in a big battle, losing quite a few personnel and equipment, they're just not going to be able to bounce back, and they don't. So eventually Berlin falls. Over 5 million Germans and their allies are killed in this whole fighting on the Eastern Front. Well, about 10 million Russian soldiers were killed. Over 20 million civilians killed. These are mostly Russian civilians and Jews, although there's certainly some German fatalities in the latter part of the war. And Germany surrenders May 7th, 1945. This picture here is a famous picture of the Russians putting a flag up over the Reichstag, or the equivalent of our congressional building here in the U.S. Capitol. And then the Japanese surrender. Iwo Jima is the first of the home islands invaded. My grandfather actually fought there, and it was a high cost for the operation. A lot of people died. The soldiers fought until the very end, and it's considered a factor in the use of the atomic bomb. And the atomic bombs are dropped on Hiroshima August 6th and Nagasaki August 9th. Same day the Soviet Union actually declares war and crosses into Manchuria and Korea. So there's a lot of debate about whether these bombs should have been dropped at all. Again, I don't actually have an opinion. I see both sides. I guess the fact is that it did happen. There's a lot of speculation about what really caused the Japanese to surrender at this point. I'm sure it had a big factor. It was a big factor in the surrender. But on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito forces the government to surrender. In general, the emperor was informed of the government, but didn't really interject too often, although when he did, he was supposed to be listened to. And in this case, the military had been doing a lot of things on their own, although they controlled the government at this point. And he makes an announcement via radio to the country to make sure that there's no coup attempt. In other words, an attempt to overthrow him, and saying that the war's over, that we've surrendered. And the formal surrender is signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd. So that's World War II in a nutshell. There's a lot more that is there. It's one of those periods of history that a lot happened, number one, and it's so interesting to so many people that a lot's been written about it. Number two, you can spend your whole life studying World War II and always find new things. I like World War II in terms of I'm interested in like what caused it to happen and how like the entire world could become embroiled to this level of destruction. And my grandfather fought in World War II, so there's a little bit of interest there. But I'm still to this day, I've probably read a couple hundred books on World War II, and I'm still always discovering new things. Very fascinating period of history. But at any rate, if you do have any other questions, feel free to email me and ask them. And down in the comments, don't forget you're answering, was the attack on Pearl Harbor really a surprise? And more importantly, was it ethical? Was it quote unquote right? And I look forward to hearing your answers on that. All right, good to talk to you, 8th grade, and I will see you guys on Wednesday to talk about your projects. All right, take care.